Before we introduce our first speaker, just a couple housekeeping items. We'll walk through an agenda, but we wanted to kind of give you a snapshot of the purpose of this event. And obviously, we're all involved in ag, and we know the number of meetings that come at us throughout the course of a year, be it grain meetings or agronomy update meetings or even feed meetings. The purpose of this is to attach what happens on farm and on-farm economics and technology and productivity, and connect that to the cash flow, connect it to grain marketing and your paycheck. So that was the purpose, and we reached out to two very influential keynote speakers we hope you're going to enjoy and give you some time to ask personal questions. We're committed at River Valley to making sure that we provide relevant solutions, but one of our other commitments is to ensure we provide relevant information. And we feel it's an obligation to make sure we bring information and knowledge to our customer base, and without these key vendors and partners, we wouldn't be able to do that. So thank you very much for your commitment. All of these sponsors not only contributed time and also contributed finances, but are here today to provide an opportunity or a platform for you to have one-on-one conversations. And special thanks to Monsanto. They really stepped up and allowed us to put an event in such a great venue. So thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. The agenda for this afternoon, we're going to start with Mr. Vande Logt and have a break. In between there, our CEO, Tom Lighting, is going to touch on some macro economics of crop nutrients, and then we'll allow some question time for both of them. Mr. Todd Hobbs will then jump into grain marketing and attach the cash flow side of this to our discussion. We'll have a Q&A session. And then from there head into a fun evening with a social hour and a dinner, really nice dinner planned, and dueling pianos. This agenda and the details of this agenda was put together by several River Valley employees, but one I want to recognize is Jane Karstensen in the back of the room in that floral outfit there. Thank you very much. She put a lot of time and effort into putting this on for us today. We want to introduce our first speaker, Executive Vice President and COO of Ag Technology for Land O'Lakes, Mike Vande Logt. He's been in industry for 40 years, 30 of that with Land O'Lakes, and he leads the Ag Technology platform for LOL. We've had the opportunity to listen to him speak several times in the past few years, and he's deeply passionate about on-farm economics and about profitable productivity. And he's going to spend an hour or so with us here visiting about that. We hope you enjoy your time with Mike, and please, at the end, speak up and ask questions. Mike?
I'm going to talk about technology. How about that? So thanks for the nice introduction there. I was just at a meeting with Tom last week, and the guy introduced me there as the guy that's been around here forever. So I really appreciate the nice introduction there. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a plant breeder by trade. Ironically, I was born in 1954. 1954, Watson and Crick broke the genetic code, which was basically really the start of the advancement of the discipline of science of genetics. So literally, I have this perspective of basically it's happened in my lifetime. And so I want to forewarn you that you're hearing a biased opinion from a speaker who has a lot of, that sees it from a genetic perspective, right? So I lean towards that part of the business. And what I want to just basically talk about is, where we are in agriculture today, because again, I've had that perspective of looking at it for a long time. And right now, we're in this period of consolidation, right? I mean, this is, I love this slide. It's a Darwinism look at consolidation, right? I mean, he would probably have called it, survival of the fittest, right? But certainly, this is where we're at, and we see it everywhere, right? So I'm at Winfield. We just merged with United Suppliers here last year. River Valley Co-op's gone through a whole group of mergers as they become the major player in this geography. We see it with Dow, DuPont, Monsanto, Bayer, and certainly we see it at your level as well, right? I mean, at $6 corn, everybody with 200 acres and an old planter in the barn is willing to take the risk of too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry. But now that we're back at $3 corn again, not so much so, and we're seeing a lot of the hand changing as well. So, you know, consolidation is absolutely being driven. So when you start thinking about, you know, what's driving it, you know, the first one is, you know, we're back to $3 corn again. I mean, basically it's been 10 years since we've had this an extended cycle of $3 corn. And in that 10-year period, in what today is a 35 billion bushel worldwide corn market, in the last 10 years, we added 1 billion bushel a year, or 40%. 1 billion bushel a year, 40% more. Half of that was ethanol. Well, actually not, 5 billion bushels, but only 3.3 because you got the distiller's grain that goes back into feed, and then the rest of that was global demand. In that same 10-year period, we had 5 crops, 5 worldwide crops, 3 in northern hemisphere, 2 in southern hemisphere, that were below trend yield, including 2012, the hottest, driest year ever. And yet, here we are back at $3 corn again. And the reason we're back at $3 corn again is that productivity has kept pace and has actually gotten ahead of increases in global demand. Then let's add to that, in that same 10-year period, that just Monsanto, Syngenta, Dow, DuPont, Bayer, and BASF spent over $55 billion in new research to bring even more productivity to the marketplace. And that $55 billion in the last 10 years is probably more than the history of mankind spent up until 10 years ago. So there's a plethora of more productivity coming to the marketplace. And when you start to look at it going forward, you know, right now global demand's growing at 500 million bushels a year. There's 400 million global corn acres. So from a productivity basis, all we have to get is 1.25 bushel a year to keep up with demand, right? So, you know, as far as, you know, we're looking at it, you know, I mean, flat prices. Now, China decides to go into ethanol, which they're talking about. You know, that changes it really quickly. But the point I'm making is that, you know, in terms of how we're looking at the market, you know, commodity prices, you know, if $5, $6 corn is in your short-term, mid-term plan, you know, good luck with that, because, you know, I mean, you know, we really don't see that that coming to the marketplace. So the forces of consolidation are powerful. The first one, you know, I just talked about it, declining margins. And this is such an obvious statement, but it is so onerous if you really think about it, is that if regardless, if it's you're buying inputs or we're selling inputs, it takes twice as many bushels to pay for an input at $3 corn as it does at $6. So what that means to the economics of what a profitable bushel and a profitable acre is really onerous, right? I mean, you have to be so careful that every input investment that you're making has a predictable outcome associated with it because of how competitive it is and how, you know, bad decisions could work against you so quickly. If you're looking at, you know, how all of the consolidations is happening in our area, certainly what regulatory is doing in terms of the Monsanto, Syngenta, Dow, DuPont things is so significant because just in the last 5 years, and of course a lot of this was driven more from the previous administration than the administration that's in the presidency today, but you know, the cost of just bringing a new active ingredient or a new biotech trait had gone from $130 million to $300 million. So again, a very, very dramatic increase. Another piece that's really driving a lot of the consolidation at the basic level is that the main crop protection products that were driving the margin lines of a lot of the basic companies, you know, the azoxy fungicides, the HPPD, the mesotrione types of herbicides, and the neonic seed treatment insecticides, they're all coming off patent. So, you know, I mean, we all saw what happened to glyphosate and Roundup. And, you know, so all of a sudden, their ability to generate margins is getting really compressed. That's part of the reason they're spending $55 billion in more productivity, because they know that they have to bring a lot more innovation to the marketplace because the current portfolio of products that they're selling are all coming off of patent. And then the other thing that's driving a lot of their consolidation, which is going to be an interesting one, is the the idea of the seed crop protection bundle, right? So you got all this chemistry coming off of patent. It's going to be very difficult for them to differentiate themselves on the crop protection side of the business because they're selling stuff that's more alike than different. It's coming off patent, so it's hard to keep your brand alive. But seed, because the seed, and again, I told you I got biased because I'm a seed guy, right? I'm a genetics guy. But seed, you know, you're always developing new genetics every single year. So the vitality of your brand is so much better in the seed business than the crop protection business. So this idea then of having a great seed brand and tying that into a bundle with crop protection is one of the things that's driving it. And then the other thing that's so interesting is all of this stuff has come off patent and the generic piece has started to gain some strength. Just at the time that was happening, China buys Syngenta, so they buy a brand. So now all of a sudden they're selling branded products in the marketplace. And then they do this, and they have an environmental renewal where they went and closed down a whole bunch of the chemical factories in China. So all of a sudden the generic supply of things is getting really stressed, and now the difference between branded and generic is getting narrower and narrower. So there's a lot of dynamics and the mergers that are going on. Again, you know, my Darwinism look at consolidation, that certainly is occurring in this space. And size and scale counts. You know, I know when we took a look at the math of Winfield United, bringing Legacy Winfield, Land O'Lakes Winfield, and Legacy United suppliers, and it put us at over 35% market share in the crop protection space. Given all of the Darwinism going on there, I mean, being the #1 player and having that size and scale, it's really important because you have more buying power, and then you can amortize all of your costs over a lot bigger footprint. No different than what a lot of you are trying to do in your farming operation as well. But certainly, when we look at the business, at what's going on in agriculture, you know, we're in a severe period of survival of the fittest. Now, there's another side of the story here, and I alluded it to. So we always get annual reports of all the major crop protection companies and keep track of what their research spend looks like. So this is tracking what their research spend has looked like since 2000. And you can just see some really interesting things that happened there. Was, you know, the first one was Roundup Ready and BT corn, corn rootworm corn. You know, so it looked like we were going to be able to control weeds really inexpensively and with such high efficacy. And you know, the rootworm and BT traits were working real well, and the investment in research flattened out. But then along came resistance, and then the other thing that came along is molecular plant breeding, where they started to figure out how to do plant breeding so much better, and the genetic yield started to go higher. And they all saw, wow, that's a good spot to be in. You can just see how dramatically they were increasing their spending, and now it's flattened off. Now, the reason that I point that out, though, is that it takes about 10 years to bring a new crop protection active ingredient, a new biotech trait, and it takes about 7, 8 years to bring new genetics to the marketplace. So you can see that there's this latent effect. I just want to kind of reiterate the fact that there is a whole bunch of newer, higher productivity technology that's going to be coming down the road here at us in the next 5, 6 years because of how long it takes those investments to pay off. So and that chart, you know, really talks about it. And then, of course, the other thing that really came alive when the yield of the genetics got so high, all of a sudden the response to keeping them alive later in the year. So if you get a 5% kick by keeping that corn plant alive 5 more days in September. Well, if you had 150 bushel, that was worth 7.5 bushel, right? But at 250 bushel, you know, so this whole thing about plant health and fungicides has really taken off because you can get so many more bushels, and because you can get so many more bushels, the economic response is so much better. So that was a little bit of one side of the story, you know, in terms of the pressure on pricing and, you know, all of that noise that's going on. The rest of my presentation, though, I want to really focus on the other side of it because it's the opportunity side of the story here because it's, you know, it's what's going on in genetics. So if you take a look at the last 4 years, average USDA U.S. corn yield in the U.S., last 4 years, highest that it's ever been, best stretch that we've ever had, it's averaged 170 bushel. In that same 4 years, if you would take a look at the National Corn Growers Contest winner and what their average yield was over the last 4 years, it's 534 bushel. So the difference between what we used to think a corn plant could yield, has totally changed. And what's changed it is this whole thing about molecular plant breeding. So I mentioned I was educated as a plant breeder. And the bottleneck in plant breeding was that it was easy to make inbred lines and make hybrids. The bottleneck was testing the hybrids. So what you tried to do was take the ones that looked the best and put them in yield trials, and you'd go try to get 40 locations across the Corn Belt, replicate it 4 different times, and try to get 2 or 3 years of data to try and identify the highest yielding hybrid, right? And that's why hybrids lasted so much longer in those days. Here's how plant breeding is done today. A robot grabs a kernel, turns it to a certain angle so that the germ is over here, and then it goes down to the bottom of the kernel here and chips off a little piece of the pericarp so that the seed is still alive. That's a really important piece. Seed is still alive, polymerizes all the DNA, and then that robot does what you've all seen in the television, the CSI television shows. They always have that test that they run that proves that the genes in the hair found at the scene of the crime is identical to the gene in the hair from the head of the suspect, right? So they use that technology to look for about 4,000 genes in the corn plant that we now know are associated with high yield, good stalks, good emergence, high test weight, good disease resistance, all of those things. And if that particular seed then, after doing the tests, has 3,800 or so, or wherever they set their benchmark, has 3,800 or more of those genes, the robot takes the seed over here, drops it into an envelope, and that's what goes out into the field to get tested. And if it has 3,799, it just discards the seed with any human being ever even touching it. But here's the big deal, is that in the old time, you had 1 chance a year to go run those in yield trials. This dang robot works 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, and goes through zillions of kernels looking for just those few that have all the genes that we're looking for. So that's why you've seen this astronomical change in high-end yield potential. Now, I mentioned that the corn growers, they're detecting it, but so do you guys, right? I mean, you got yield monitors, you're going across those fields on pixel by pixel, yield moisture. I can always tell when harvest season is starting, because when harvest season is starting, my phone goes ding, 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 and I pick up my phone, and what is it? What's on my phone? What am I getting sent? Pictures of yield monitors. And why am I getting sent that picture of that yield monitor? Because that pixel was the highest yielding pixel that farmer had ever got, and he wanted to share that experience using technology. He wanted to share that experience with me. But we all know it, right? And when that pixel does that 370 bushel, what's happened there? Well, what's happened is that you had the right hybrid for that soil type. It was at the right population. The fertility was right. The disease control was right. The insect control was right. Everything was right. And boom, there you had it, 370 bushel on that pixel. Now, when the next pixel went to 340, you should be asking yourself, well, gee, what could I have done to make that one a 371, right? Or when you get to that other side of the field, when this has been doing 370 and over there it's 280, it's like, could there have been something different that we could have done to get maybe that to 300 or 310, right? So that's what's going on in the business right now. And though we all can find, reasons to get down and, gee, corn's back in the threes again, but the bushels is totally different, right? And at the end of the day, your income per acre is bushels times price equals, right? So getting bushels, if you really look at the opportunity in agriculture today, it's on the bushel side. That's where it's happening. And the potential is still going. So this year, I was really surprised. So 2016, think back to 2016. The entire Corn Belt planted early. We had early moisture, fast germination, early heat units, generated early biomass, everything that the plant growth models say generates high yield. And in 2016, it all happened just perfect, and we grew a record crop, just like the models said. Then you go to 2017. 2017, some guys planted early, some guys planted late. The Eastern Corn Belt planted 3 times. The Eastern Corn Belt was planted late, too wet. The Western Corn Belt was too dry. Southern Corn Belt got southern rust, which devastates corn. And I'm from the Northern Corn Belt, and it was really too cool that by the time that the grain fill was coming, we were already in the short days of September, and we were just running out of heat units to really make it happen. And yet we grew another record crop. I mean, 2017 just blew us all away. It was like, how could that happen? And then we started to think, you know what? We're not only making gains now genetically in high-end yield potential, but the ability for the plant to handle the stresses as well is really coming along quickly, right? And again, when you can go through a zillion kernels, I mean, it's like the football team that comes from the school that has 3,000 kids playing football against the school that has 300 kids, right? I mean, the odds are just in there, they just have the advantage. And that's exactly in terms of what's going on today. So, now all of a sudden the story it's a little bit different, and for me it's about, nursing the yield out of the bag. So I've been a seed guy all my life, and then 7 years ago I got the opportunity to run the seed business and the crop protection business for Land O'Lakes. So I was in the chemical business, and 2 totally different businesses, right? The value proposition on the crop protection side is that you spray the chemical out there, and then you just go look for carcasses, right? You look for dead bugs or dead weeds, and you spray it, and they're dead. It works, right? Seed. So here's seed, right? We try to sell you $3 worth of corn in a 50-cent bag, and try to give us $300 for it, right? Because it has potential. And oh, by the way, this bag over here has even more potential. We want to get $350 for that bag, right? But the point is that the potential out of that investment in that bag of seed doesn't come from just buying it and planting it. There's this whole other piece that you have to do. And that's where this whole story now about big data and data analytics and machine learning and artificial intelligence and all of this stuff is about trying to, how it applies us to agriculture, is trying to crack the code then of how do we nurse that high yield potential, out of that bag. And that's what we're doing. These crop growth models is all about. And we have one driven by our answer plot data, and Monsanto has one, Syngenta has one. I mean, everybody is working on this case. And really what we're trying to get to is that on a pixel by pixel basis, trying to give you the help of where you should be putting your foot on the gas and where you should be putting your foot on the brake, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to accomplish. So for example, here's what the models are telling us today, is that if you plant early, and if you get just the right amount of rainfall for your particular soil type, so you optimize the amount of available water, not too much, not too little, right? You optimize the right amount of available water, get early heat units, and drive early biomass, those spots, and this works really good for corn and really good for wheat. Soybeans is still a mystery, we haven't figured them out yet. But certainly for corn and for wheat, if you get that early growth and that early biomass, you start putting more inputs on those pixels, they're going to make you money. So for example, if you put 40 pounds of nitrogen on those particular pixels, they'll give you 40 bushel. If they get that really fast early season growth, there's a high likelihood that they'll give you 40 bushel. And think about those 40 bushel. Those 40 bushel cost you 40 cents a bushel, right? I mean, they're the cheapest bushels that you can get on your farm. Likewise, the models say that if you have a hybrid that is susceptible to a disease, and that disease is in your environment, if you put the fungicide on it, you can get 25 bushel. So that's 25 bushel that you can get for 25 bucks, right? So those bushels are $1. So, so there's just right there, there's 65 bushels that you can get for 65 cents, right? And what happens then is that if you amortize the cost of those bushels over the whole acre, you're starting to bring down your inputs per bushel. And it's that inputs per bushel calculation, which is really the calculation of who's optimizing yield, and at the end of the day, who's optimizing profitability, and how we always like it. I mean, at the end of the day, those are going to be the guys that win the battle for access to land. So when you hear all the stories about ag technology, what I just tried to talk you through was, kind of what that looks like. But at the end of the day, the piece is hey, we want to sell you inputs. Guilty. We're here to sell stuff, right? But at the end of the day, it's about being able to sell it to you in a way that we increase the odds that you're going to get a predictable outcome on those products, right? And again, that's all about data-driven and analytics. And what I like to talk about it, is, we're entering what I call now the mathematical age of agriculture, right? So we've seen all these things happen, right? We started with mechanization, once we got to tractors and bigger equipment, one farmer could do a lot more acres just physically planting, harvesting, working. And then, of course, came the chemical age, be it crop protection to protect the crop from insects or diseases, or plant nutrition, fertilizer, that really, greatly increased yield. And then we came through the biotech age, the biology age, which I just described in terms of very much being able to increase high-end yield potential from a biology perspective. But now we're in this mathematical age about how do we take data and information to take all of the pieces of the puzzle here and put them together in a way that gets you into a predictable outcome. So the first guy who really got us thinking about this is Fred Below. And I think you've had Fred here before. Great guy, right? Entertaining speaker. And he's a fun guy to be around and to communicate and to debate with. But this was the kind of the research that as soon as he started to figure out that when we were telling him, the high-end yield potential is really going up, he said, well, okay, so what does it take for the rest of the system to be able to go get that high-end yield potential? And so what this chart is trying to say is that just think of all of the cornfields so for him, this is representative of all of the cornfields in Illinois. And all of the fields in Illinois, if you take a mathematical average, they have a mean, right? But each individual field has a different yield from the average, right? And then he's trying to say, okay, so how can we partition that variance and know what it's coming from? How can the farmer do production practices to make up for that variance from the average? And here's what he came up with. The first one, 27% of the variance is from the weather. Well, that makes sense, right? Too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry. That's the biggest issue that we all deal with. When spring comes and we're ready to plant the crop, we have the perfect plan, right? But it's that darn too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry that always messes up the plan that we got in place. Nitrogen management, 26%. And at first I thought, oh, come on, weather at 27, nitrogen at 26. But think of a field of corn out there that's too wet or too dry, and then think of a field of corn out there that doesn't have any nitrogen on it. And it really does kind of look kind of the same, right? And hybrid, picking the right hybrid was 19%, previous crop was 10, and plant population was 8, and the tillage, So when we started to take a look at that model, we said, okay, so given how that looks, how could we mathematically really drive an analysis that could get us mathematically to that kind of predictable outcome? Well, the resource that we had is we had our answer plots. And the one thing that we had that Below didn't have is, he had 5 locations in Illinois, and even the 115-day hybrids only got planted in 3 of them, right? So we got 200 locations, and we have 20 crews of crops, and they all have of cropping equipment, and every one of them is the same, right? So everybody plants with the same planter. Every plot combine is the same combine, and we're very, very disciplined that everything we do at every location is exactly the same. No room for entrepreneurship here. This is about rote process. And go across the whole U.S. and try and come up with a way of how can we calculate that, and then how can we predict it, right? So what we're doing, given the model that that Bilo had there is that we take every new hybrid from Monsanto, Syngenta, down DuPont, all their newest hybrids that are 1 or 2 years old, and then all of the highest selling standard hybrids. And then we plant them on first-year corn versus continuous corn. We plant them with fungicide, without fungicide. We plant them at 38,000 versus 30,000. And we plant them at a rate of nitrogen that's unlimited. So we see their high end. And then a rate of nitrogen at that location that we know usually will trip them into nitrogen deficiency to see how well they'll tolerate low nitrogen deficiency. Trying to get all of those things in his model. Let's get them out there in the field and let's test everything under that. And then let's use big data analytics and see if we can get predictable about how we do that. So this chart here kind of talks about what that looks like. So the first one here is the response to population, right? So this is 30,000 versus 38,000. And the number you're looking at there is what the hybrid yield at 38 versus 30. So on the average, over all those years, the average was 8.3. You know, I thought it was going to be a hell of a lot higher than that. I mean, I thought there was going to be a 20, 30 bushel difference, right? But it was only 8, because the hybrids today, one of the things that we have the genes for is we now know the genes that really push silks out very, very quickly. Heck, there isn't any hybrids that come out anymore that don't silk, right? I mean, that's a problem that we have fixed, right? You know, so now things make huge years and hold on to a lot of it. And you know, the variance was 1.2, meaning you had these big flex-steered hybrids that basically yielded the same at 30 versus 38. But the most fixed-steered hybrids still only had 18.4 bushel difference. And then, of course, we do this with about 250 hybrids. And you know, you have everything in between, right? Well, the one thing that, you know, so the first thing, we all do variable rate maps. If you're doing variable rate maps for a hybrid and you don't even know how the hybrid responds to population, I mean, you're just basically making stuff up, right? You know, I mean, if you're not having a data-driven way to do it. But here's the scariest part about the math on this, right? Think of 8,000 kernel different, and think of a bag of seed corn at $320 with 80,000 kernels in it. So that means you're paying $4 a thousand for your kernels. Right? So 8,000 more plants, you need 8 bushels just to pay for it at $4 corn, right? So it's a break-even value proposition. So again, I'm just trying to give you an example of how important having the data, understanding the response, and trying to drive it to a predictable outcome, you know, how important that one is, right? Response to nitrogen. So this is how the hybrids did it on limited nitrogen minus how they did it limited nitrogen, what the difference was. So, you know, it was the difference between unlimited nitrogen and then the limited nitrogen, right? So it averaged about 60 bushel difference. But the variance by hybrid, now I'm gonna have to go back to my memory here, but I think the variance by hybrid was like 30 bushels to 90, meaning there were a group of hybrids that you needed to get the nitrogen to them to really get the yield performance out of them, right? And these are the ones that give you that when you get the early biomass and you're starting to get that, you're trying to get predictable of putting the 40 pounds of nitrogen. It's those highly responsive ones that quickly give you that 40 bushel and give you those 40-cent bushels, right? There we go. Oh, so 39.5 to 97.2. The average was 62.2, right? So think of those fields that you have out there that historically are always your highest yielding fields. They're either tiled or you have a little bit of slope to them so that you know you can get into them. And they always yield really good, and now you got that early biomass on them, right? There you go. Now you've got set up the circumstances, everything you need, right? I got in early, got the early biomass, and now I'm going to put, I have a hybrid that responds. I got the data that says the hybrid responds, and now I'm going to go out there and put the nitrogen on. So you're set up for a predictable outcome. Now you got those hybrids there that are like only 40 bushel. Why would anybody want to plant those? Well, let's say you got a sticky clay field that's low and wet. It frequently has standing water in it. You can't always get in. I mean, you got some fields like that? You know, now you're taking a hybrid that you know can tolerate the lower nitrogen that you're probably not going to get on. So it's not only about knowing when to put your foot on the gas, but understanding the economics of when you got to put your foot on the brake as well, right? And how you manage around that. Response to rotation. So on the average, this is how a hybrid did on corn following beans versus how it does on corn. So one that has a high number, like 30, that means that on corn after beans it was great. But on corn it was really bad, right? So, and of course that is because most of the diseases and insects of corn carry over on the residue. So corn on corn is a much tougher environment, and you don't get the nitrogen coming over late from your soybeans, and corn tends to remove more moisture, more water out of the profile than a previous crop of beans. So a corn on corn hybrid has to have better drought tolerance, better disease tolerance, better tolerance to running out of nitrogen late in the season. So I mean that's why you see those variances in the score. But if you're growing corn on corn, you got to make sure you got a hybrid that works in that environment. And this is the one that really, this is our newest one. And I'm going to, at the end of this, I'm going to take you through an example on fungicide because it tells the story so dramatically well. But the average response to fungicide, you can see it through the year. This is a new study because we had to invent a piece of equipment. It's kind of a big high boy thing. We used detasseling machines so that we could go over the top and do small plot work for fungicides. Otherwise, the way they do it is you have graduate students or interns that walk down a row with a sprayer and walk down by hand, and the rate is determined about how fast they walk. And by the way, when I was in college, I was one of those interns, and I did pretty good on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, but I was terrible on Monday morning. So having a mechanized way, again, that you can do good data, good process is really important. But the response to fungicide, average 12.8, and you can see that 11.9, 15, 11.2, 12.8 is the average, but the variance 0 to 37. So everybody has heard the story about, I put fungicide in half the field and I didn't put it on the other half and I got 25 bushels. Everybody's heard that, but fungicide is only used on 20% of the corn acres. If every acre got 25 bushels, it would be used on 100% of the corn acres, right? But it's so hybrid, specific on which ones are responding and which ones are not. And then remember, you got to have the disease there too, right? That's part of the story as well. So again, if you add all these things up, there's 90 bushels of variance going on just about understanding what those high-priced genetics, by the way, genetics is now the highest investment that you make per acre. But again, this is about how you nurse the value out of that bag. And there's 90 bushel of variance that you can get there by just getting all this right. And for the people that I've been around here forever, and there's some other people here that I came here in 1990. There's a bunch of people in the room that, as I was walking in, said, "Hey, do you remember in 1992?" But this whole thing, we've always trying to position the cooperative system as being the trusted advisor position, right? But if you're not an expert in seed, at the investment that you guys made in seed, how tight the margins are, and how tough it is to squeeze profitability out, if you're not an expert in seed, you can't be a trusted advisor. I mean, it's gotten to be such a big deal. Again, plant breeder by trade, you're getting a biased perspective from me. So that's why, when we talk about ag technology, that's what we're trying to accomplish here. So this one slide here pretty much talks about the system that we're trying to drive. Right there on the lower left is our answer plot data, and that's an important part of this. A lot of people talk about, we'll just get all the yield maps back from all the fields out there, and we'll take that all and we'll find out, what the best hybrids are and be able to do it that way. But the problem with doing it that way is that, first off, to get enough data on what the best hybrid is, given all of the different conditions out there, you got to get probably 1,500, 2,000 fields before you would have a really good data set. And then all of the farmers that had all of those fields of corn, half of those farmers would had to have had a below average experience with the hybrid before you get the insight, right? So I mean, you become the guinea pig, right? And then it's like, Hey, how did hybrid ABCD do for you? Well, not very good. Well, where'd you plant it? Well, I planted it on the Smith farm over there. Soil type's pretty light. Yeah, our data came back this year and said you shouldn't plant it on sandy soils. Right? I mean, that's not a very good outcome for you as a farmer, right? So this whole thing about answer plots and sorting it all out on small plots to give a good indication of how it's going to do makes the experiments happen where you're finding out at our expense and not your expense. Okay, so the next piece of it is all about the weather, because like I said, everything goes perfect in agriculture except for too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry. And one of the things that you have to make these systems work is that you have to have a weather provider that at least is able to calculate, estimate what the weather is on a pixel by pixel basis in that field, right? I mean, it's not only measuring the field. If you got a section field, it's measuring it by pixel across that field. And as I mentioned, the whole piece here, certainly getting the right moisture for your soil type, getting the right early heat units, and getting the early biomass, the weather piece is really important. So then the next piece that we do a lot of work with satellite imagery. And we're big proponents of satellite imagery because it's about biomass, right? And that's what satellite imagery is measuring. As the satellite goes over your field, it's measuring the amount of biomass in that field on a pixel by pixel basis. So it's able to pick out the spots in the field where you have big biomass and the spots in the field where you don't have as much. And then the other really interesting thing that we've been able to do with this satellite imagery, because we get it frequently, we get it right now where the most you can get it is about an image every 5 days, right? Which means, if you have clouds, you don't get it that 5 days, and then there's always some places where you don't, so it's hit and miss. But if during the end of May through June, you can get 1 or 2 good images, and then take a look at how those images have done over the past years, all of a sudden you can start to benchmark them. So one of the things that, the crop health monitor piece there is that we take the field and we take the images and we ask you for 2 pieces of information: planting date and what the hybrid is. And if you'll give us planting date and hybrid, we'll compare your field that was planted to all of the other fields in your area that were planted with the same hybrid about the same date, and benchmark them all against each other. And be able to show you that says, hey, your fields, of the 4 fields that you have in this hybrid, this one is over-indexing. So that's the one that has the most biomass. So there, you got a piece of information. If I'm going to put some more inputs out there, that field is over-indexing, I can at least increase my predictable outcome. And then if this field over here is under-indexing, there's something wrong. What's wrong with it? Is it a micronutrient problem? Is it a sulfur problem? Did it run out? Did you get supersaturated? You ran out of nitrogen? But you can at least have, let's go out and take a look at that spot in that field and seeing if there's something, that I can fix. The thing about satellite imagery is that it's a proxy for a yield map, right? I mean, it's giving you the good spots and the bad spots, and that yield map at the end of the field might look slightly different, but the satellite imagery is a really good proxy for it. But this is the big difference, is that the yield map, by the time you get the yield map, you're looking back and seeing what happens. The satellite imagery, you're getting a live picture of new data that's coming back from that field during the growing season. It's the same thing with the weather data, of getting live data back from the field during the growing season to give you more information to make the decision during the season. Likewise, when you get good spots and bad spots, we think it's smart to go into the good spots and bad spots, take a tissue analysis of that spot. Because now you can take a look at the plant nutrition and say, okay, what's the difference between the good spots and bad spots, and is there something that I can do to fix it here? It might be something as simple as sulfur or boron. It might be something much more serious about nitrogen. But again, if it's something you can't fix, at least it's telling you, put your foot on the brake on that particular field, right? And then finally, the as-applied data. So, as you're putting stuff on the field, or as the cooperative is putting, applying things to the field, again, that's more data coming back from the field and being able to update the growth model. And every time a new piece of information comes in, it updates it. So this is ironic, but we're in a casino, right? How many of you guys, how many people in here play blackjack or have played blackjack? Yeah. So think of the difference in the odds of not having to bet until you see your first card. That's a lot nicer game to play, isn't it? If you've got a 10 versus a 4, now I get to bet, right? So that's why this whole thing of understanding what's happening during the season, getting data back, and making those in-season decisions, it's like MapQuest, right? When you go too far, you missed your turn, what does she come back and say? Recalibrating, right? Recalibrating. So that's what that growth model is doing. It's recalibrating the model going forward. And like I said, the only thing that we need from you to give us to make this whole system work is hybrid and planning date. So it's scalable, right? It's a very, very, very scalable without having to put tons of input in to make it work. Now, one other thing that, and this is my newest analogy, and I like to talk about analogies because it is the most understanding for me. How many of you have watched the Super Bowl this year? I mean, it's really interesting, right? At the end of the third quarter, it was already the most yards ever in a Super Bowl. And by the end of the game, it was the most yards ever in an NFL football game. But if you really watched it, it's showing you the mathematical age or the evolution of what's going on in football, right? So in football, the way they used to do it was they called the play in the huddle and came up and they ran the play, right? Which is just like when you put all of your inputs on pre-planned, right? Same thing, right? And then it's evolved to Aaron Rodgers and Brady and these guys that come up to the line of scrimmage and look at the defense and say, oh, there's a hole in this defense, I'm going to take the play over here, right? So it's evolved there. Until you watched Philadelphia. They've taken it to another whole new level as they get to the line. He says, hut, he gets the ball, and nobody knows the play yet. That's the offense that they're running. And what they do is they take a step back, and he puts the ball in the running back's gut, and then he looks for two specific players on the defense and how they're moving, and then based on how they're moving, he decides if he's going to leave the ball there or if he's going to take the ball out and throw a pass. So literally, he's making the decision on what the play is during the play, right? So it's I think it's an analogy that works in terms of, where we believe this mathematical age of agriculture is going. So this is what it kind of looks like. And by the way, River Valley is they're one of our poster childs for jumping onto new technology, and we're implementing this technology at this cooperative right now, and they're one of the first 3 or 4 cooperatives to be jumping on it. So thank you for being on the bleeding edge. We appreciate that. But this is what this is an example of what it would look like. A typical website. You would come into the website, and then when you come into the website, you can see the crop health monitor there, and how that whole piece on the left. And by the way, that is all broken up into specific segments like that. You can see the different boxes, and the different boxes are so that you can take it out on your phone and see each of those boxes makes a plate. So you'll be able to do the same thing on your cell phone, but it'll just be one of the six different plates that are up there. So the first thing, it gives you just some basic highlights of what's happening in your field. So this one is saying you've got 4 fields trending up. And the plant growth model saw a nitrogen deficiency in a field, and field 47, there's a big gap between what the calculated yield is and what the formula still thinks your potential yield is, your yield is. And then you can get into the guts of it, right? So this is the crop health monitor. So if you look under corn there, what that's saying is that of your 27 fields of corn that you have, okay, there's 15 that are average. You have 9 fields that are above average, and you have 3 that are below average. So the ones that are above average, again, give you an idea. Those are the ones I should be thinking about putting some incremental investment into. The ones that are below average, let's get in the pickup and go out there and take a look and see, what's going on in that field, or maybe I should get a tissue analysis of that particular field. And then you can get into the field specific, where the model is saying, like that first one, there's 27, the auto farm, it's in V9. We have the mathematical model, it calculates at what stage your growth is, and there's 27 bushel between what the model has calculated the potential is and what it thinks you're going to get. But then you got the one field there that says 165. So, again, it's about helping you set priorities and understanding where you got the most potential to go out and make something happen. So let's talk about how it all comes together, just as an example. So this was the response to fungicide data this year, right? 250 hybrids of data in terms of how it did with fungicide or without fungicide. So as I mentioned, there was an 11.2 bushel average, but you can see the variance there from 0 to 37. So a tremendous amount of variance. That hybrid way on the right, I mean, the 249th hybrid was 30. That other one way at the end there was 7 bushel more. I mean, if I'm planting that hybrid, I probably want to make sure that I was really checking the models and making sure that if there's diseases even smelling in that area, I better get a fungicide on it. But that's what the variance looks like. You can see the line where it's break even in terms of financially applying the fungicide, and you can see where the average is. But when you look at that chart, you can understand why one farmer is getting a 25 bushel response and why another guy says, I did that and I didn't see anything, right? I mean, you can just see just in the variance that we're getting on the genetics. Then we had a really interesting thing. I was mentioning before, you have to have the disease in your area. So, last year we did both TriverPro and Headline AMP. And, the Headline AMP data, and I'm sorry, the TriverPro data came back and it was like, wow, that stuff did a lot better. And then we went back and took a look at the locations where it did better, and it was at all the locations where we had heavy southern rust. So it's not just hybrid responds and hybrid don't. Now all of a sudden the model's we got to start thinking about, and this is why 200 locations is so important. It's not only just about does the hybrid respond or not, but it's about what is the particular disease, and given the particular disease, how do all the fungicides work on that particular disease, right? It's much more complicated than it just looks. That's why 200 locations and doing the small plot work ahead of time is so important to be able to get to your predictable outcomes. So this is how we picture this kind of system happening, right? So you have a disease map, and there's models that predict disease. So let's say this is the model that's predicting northern corn leaf blight, right? So all of a sudden the model says, hey, in my area, northern corn leaf blight looks like the models are saying we're going to have that disease this year. Remember, you got to rely on models, because once the disease is there and you put the fungicide on, it's only revenge. You're not going to get an economic response. You're too late. I mean, you can feel better about it because you killed the disease, right? But it's only revenge. It's not economic. Okay, so there's disease in my area. It's northern corn leaf blight. Let's go take a look at our data. What are our hybrids that are sensitive to northern corn leaf blight and respond to fungicide, and what is the fungicide that we need to be used, right? Now, if you're in our system and you gave us hybrid and planting date, we already know the fields where that, so we know who of our customers have planted the sensitive hybrids, and we know what field you've planted them in, right? So now we can start communicating with you over the website digitally. We can start sending you notices that says, hey, the models are saying these are the 2 diseases of the year. You have these hybrids over here that we think we're going to respond to a fungicide. These are the fields that those hybrids are planted in. Now you're getting to a place where you're getting a predictable outcome. It's not just sitting there saying, gee, should I put fungicide on my corn or not this year? Right? Now all of a sudden you got a whole bunch of data that helps you get to that point of having a predictable outcome. So, again, this whole thing, yield data is great, but yield data you get at the end of the season and you're looking back. And this whole thing that we're trying to set up, using our answer plot data and satellite imagery and the tissue analysis, you know, and the weather that's going on a pixel by pixel in your field that year, we're trying to tell you what's happening now to help you make a decision, right? I mean, you know, and I happened to see this particular picture here, which was like, hey, that's exactly what we're trying to do, right? So I drove down here, took a few back road shortcuts, you know, from the Twin Cities. And you get on the single lane road. The semis like to take those same shortcuts too. So you're on that single lane road and you're trying to pass, right? But Samsung put a camera in the front of their truck and put a big TV in the back of their truck so that you can see what's coming, right? So again, this whole piece about trying to get predictable, you know, that's exactly what we're trying to do. The last piece, and this is, you know, basically my last content slide, is, you know, the whole story of sustainability, right? And, you know, there's still a few people who roll their eyes when you start talking about this, but certainly Iowa, with what we all saw with the lawsuits and everything, and, you know, we all know that this whole piece of what consumers think is important because they're 100% of the buyers and we're only 2% of the growers involved, and that means they have 98% of the votes and we have 2% of the votes, and that puts, I mean, that gives them the muscle, right? You just got to understand where the muscle in this story is. The muscle is in their camp. So this whole thing about what is the most sustainable bushel, just going back to that piece where I was describing, you know, the 40 bushels that you get for the 40 pounds of nitrogen and the 25 that you get for the fungicide, and trying to get to the fewest inputs per bushel because that's your most profitable bushel. But if we could get the sustainability crowd to buy into the fact that the most sustainable bushels on the planet are the bushels that have the fewest inputs per bushel, then all of a sudden this technology would be driving sustainability as well. And then all of a sudden you would have grower profitability driving sustainability, and now you'd have a system that would work for everybody, right? So this whole piece about, you know, how we work together, you know, with the consumers and what they're trying to look for, because I think this is what, you know, this is what is important to them. You know, how do we grow a bushel using the fewest resources on the planet so there's more resources left for the people who come after us? And then one other last piece. You know, again, we're into this field map thing. The next piece that we have coming into R7, which is we got hold of the LiDAR data that the federal government. So what the government did is they flew the entire U.S. with an airplane, sent down a sound beam down to the ground, and then depending on how fast it comes back, they can get to within an inch of elevation. So we took those elevation maps, and then we on a pixel-by-pixel basis, we, using the USDA universal soil loss equation, you know, going in and being able to calculate the spots in the field that are more erodible. So this is the red. It's basically an erosion potential map is what this is. So up in the state of Minnesota, they've now, our illustrious governor up there, has put in a buffer rule, right? So within the next 10 years, every stream, 50 feet buffer, right? So we're working with the governor saying, you know, is that really the right way to do it? Because you're just taking this peanut butter spread, this core assumption that every inch along that stream bank has the same erosion potential. And as we know, that's not, because it's all about where is the water flowing, right? So what we're trying to work, and we're doing this, so the farmers that we're working with on this do not have to do the buffer rule. If they do what we're talking about here, we're saying is, here's where the water is flowing. You might need to put a 100-foot buffer in that dark-colored brown spot there, but you don't need it all the way around, you know, because you're trying to do it where the water's running, right? And by the way, this is all the USDA's data. So the USDA is supportive of taking a look at this approach. So, you know, again, you know, how do we use the technology of today to make sure that we're good stewards as well? So, you know, everything that we're trying to do here, advancing agriculture intelligently using data and ag technology. So that's the story of, you know, of where we believe we are in agriculture today. And it's really about, even though I'm a breeder, I have to now defer to the mathematicians and the IT guys, because now I think we're really into the mathematical age of agriculture, and I think that's the next place where we're coming. So with that, willing to entertain questions? Was it that bad?
Well, when you were talking about putting on the max of nitrogen to, for bigger yields, we have a lot of people really worried about nitrates in the water system. How are we going to address that to the consumers that are really worried about that, and also the overuse of chemicals?
So it's a great question. It's a great question. So, how we would see that playing out is that, again, it goes back to my blackjack example, is that you would put less nitrogen on pre. You put less on pre, because when you're putting it on pre, there's a long period of time before the plant actually absorbs it. And there's a lot of things, like I said, we have a plan, but then you got too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, that can mess up and do a lot of bad things to that nitrogen. So if you put less on early, and then you waited for the high biomass spots in the field late, okay, now we're only going to put the nitrogen on those spots. And by the way, now we're going to put it on when the roots are really big and the corn plant is in the period where it's absorbing more of the nitrogen very quickly. We're going to end up with more of those pounds of nitrogen actually into the plant. And it might mean that you're putting the same pounds of nitrogen on per acre that you were before, same number of pounds. The only thing is, now we're making sure the pounds are going on the spots where there's a higher predictability of getting a response in terms of bushels, which actually would then lower the amount that would be leachable into the water table. But great question. Thanks for asking. Well, speaking of nitrogen, Tom's going to come up and give some comments on this year's fertilizer and any other co-op updates.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Mike mentioned that he was born in 1954, but I was also, Mike. I think we talked about that over a beer, glass of wine here a couple of weeks ago. But so we're of the same age time period, and you mentioned changes in the genetic world that occurred that year. I have an exercise T-shirt that has a Super M tractor on it, and I remind my family members that I'm the same vintage as what that tractor is. So, Verla, your comment about proper use of nutrients is really right on. Just a couple comments about what you're doing as a farming community. We have a short 500,000 acres in our company that are under a grid sampling system that you participate in, where every 4 years those grids are rotated through. And then that's used for variable rate fertilizer, phosphate and potash application. It's interesting, I think you lead the pack of most of our peer companies that we talk to. Approximately 70% of the phosphate and potash that River Valley spreads for you is done on a variable rate basis to get the right products in the right place in the right time. Another interesting fact is you've really taken an aggressive step to spreading out your nitrogen applications. So today, approximately half of the urea that we would apply is being done over the top when the plant is growing, and actually about 25% of the UAN, the liquid nitrogen, is being done after the crop is planted, so that variable rate application and also spreading out the use of nitrogen to get it out there at the best time for the plant, but getting it there in a timely manner, and variable rate application is real, and it's happening out on your farms, which is neat to see. Real briefly, I'm being given just a couple of minutes and then we'll go into a break, but would like to thank you for your business and also for being here. We really appreciate the time that you've taken to be with us and the commitment in working with your cooperative team. Very briefly, again, the cooperative continues to be financially successful this year. At the end of January, we're 7 months through our fiscal year. We're seeing financial performance for the company being a touch up from the previous year. So there's some nice things happening. There's some revenue stream happening in the grain business with the carries that are in the market that are benefiting us today, and the volumes of grain that are going through. Those of you that should have seen a check come through, your board authorized deferred payment of a short $2 million of past equities, which would have us paid up, Tim, through 2007, I think. So we have about an 11-year deferred equity payout that's happening of those equities to get back to you. So thanks very much for the ability to do that. Andy had asked if I'd talk just briefly a little bit about what's going on in the fertilizer world. And those of you that have farmed through the go-go years, 2008 to 2013 or 14, seemed like fertilizer prices followed what the grain markets did. So if the grain markets were up, fertilizer prices went up with them. And through the fall here, we saw from the fall fertilizer pricing and phosphate, potash, and nitrogen to the spring input costs, a fairly significant increase of about 20% or so take place. I didn't see grain prices go up like that, did you? So you have to wonder what are the reasons for that taking place. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a background on what's happening in the production side. And phosphate and potash are basically mining industries, and nitrogen production is basically a chemical process. And so as you look at what's happening, their costs of production have not really changed dramatically. So again, why would you see those rallies that are taking place in those markets? It has a lot to do with supply and demand, and it also has a lot to do because they can. And just briefly, what does that mean? In the world market, you produce a lot of the grain that feeds the world. However, when you think, and we think in terms of corn and soybeans, but in actual production of coarse grains, when you throw in other products like wheat, rice, other commodities, sorghum, we're not as large as a percentage of the corn production that takes place in the world. On the consumption side, we only consume in the U.S. about 16% of the phosphate, potash, and nitrogen that are consumed in the world. So countries like India and China consume huge quantities, and you now, just like in grain, you're part of a world market, and our fertilizer prices are tied not to just what's happening in the U.S., but in that world market situation. Basically what I'm saying is world demand for fertilizer has been pretty good this past year. If you go back to what took place this past fall, nitrogen, phosphate, and potash producers were in a market that were at or near their cost. And since then, because of strong demand this fall and then also world demand that's taking place, we've seen markets move up relative to that. Briefly on the phosphate side, we think about phosphate mining in the U.S. is predominantly down in Florida. Mosaic, who we have a very close relationship with, is a primary producer or miner. They mine down in the phosphate in the Florida Panhandle. They made a decision in early December to close one of their primary facilities at Plant City, Florida, which kind of rattled the market a little bit here in the U.S. and caused a little bit of a rally in the pricing of it. Because of environmental pressures in Florida, along with having mined through a lot of the good or the primary phosphate rock that's down in Florida, we're gradually seeing a decrease of production of phosphate out of Florida, coming back up into the corn production area. There's a lot of new phosphate production that's coming on around the world. Mosaic has a joint venture with Saudi Arabia, and they have a new facility that just came up this past spring and early summer. So that's adding additional production, along with Morocco on the northern tip of Africa. Is a primary source of rock phosphate for the world, and there's tons of rock phosphate for the future that's going to be available there. There's aggressive expansion of mining and processing capacity of phosphate in Morocco, and also being brought in to the U.S. as rock phosphate for usage. So all those things are happening in the marketplace, but short term, some of those rallies have taken place because of demand factors around the world. On the potash side, a lot of the world potash production comes out of Canada. There's also production over in the former USSR, Belarus, and several of the other associated countries with former Russian state. Again, in the potash industry, it's really we can, and there's been a rapid consolidation, just as Mike had alluded to in the ag chem and seed business, particularly in the potash industry. Just recently, if you've kept up in the marketplace, Agrium, a large producer, along with PCS, Potash Corporation of Saskatchewan, recently merged. They also happen to be the owners of CPS, which is the largest retailer on the North American continent. And by doing that, they became by far the largest basic miner and producer of potash in the world. And so there's been new mines expanded in Canada. There's a new mine just opened up over in Belarus. Actually, we brought in some of the Belarus product this past fall. I was looking for Jim Grunhagen. You got your hand out there? One barge, was it? We kind of test drove. Good product. We were happy with what we saw there. But what's happening is that with the consolidation that's taking place, and again back in late summer, early fall, where we saw producers of potash basically marketing product near their cost to get the product out of the mine and produce it, they made the decision, because they're responsible not to you as customers, they're responsible to shareholders, and they want to maximize their value. So they took down some mines. They shut a couple of them down, laid people off. A potash mine is really expensive to construct and put into operation. It's a $1 billion plus project. But some of those mines, they like to run them at around 85% of capacity or so. They ratcheted the mine capacity back to around 60% so they could control the volume going into the world market and then take prices up. It's not good or bad, that's just the reality of that business today and how it operates, with only about half a dozen companies today that really control potash production in the world. And finally, on nitrogen, I'm sure everybody here is aware we've had a lot of new nitrogen plants come on and major expansions over the past 2 years. Up at Port Neal in near Sioux City, Iowa, CF Industries did a major expansion up there, as well as their facility down at Donaldsonville, Louisiana. And for those of you in this area, we're very fortunate. We had a world-class nitrogen plant owned by OCI, who's the parent company of the Iowa Fertilizer Company down at Weaver, Iowa. That facility came online finally this spring, Jim. Was it May we went down to the open house? It's a huge state-of-the-art facility. They produce daily, I think, around 2,500 tons of ammonia every day, and then they can put it into multiple products. Besides ammonia, they do production of UAN, urea, and then DEF for diesel engines. And their focus is on producing DEF because it's their most profitable product. That facility has had hiccups. It's about a year behind coming online, and they've had a few hiccups over the past summer and fall getting it up into operation. All those plants have added capacity here in the U.S., and What's happened is there's been strong demand offshore for nitrogen, so where we've normally imported a lot of nitrogen, we've replaced it with U.S. production, but we've also reduced the amount of imports that are coming in. Secondly, on nitrogens down at Donaldsonville, Louisiana, where CF has a huge nitrogen production facility. You can go down on that site, and I've been there several times. You can stand on their dock at the production facility on the Mississippi River, and they can put a pipe into a barge and load urea or ammonia or UAN and run it up the river tributaries into Ohio or into the Mississippi River going north up this way. Or they can also load ocean-going vessels right off that dock on the Mississippi River and send them out to Europe, particularly for UAN or for urea across the world. This past year, CF Industries had a new record set for the amount of nitrogen they produce in the U.S., and they export it rather than keeping it here. I think it was about 3 million tons they exported this past year. So we're in a very fluid market with nitrogens. We've had these new plants come on, but in reality, it's a world market in those products, and our pricing floats with that, and those products either come in or else they leave the U.S. Together. And so what we see on current pricing today is really a reflection of what the world markets have. Just take a break. Do we have any questions? Not just for myself, but also for Mike. If not, maybe just a closing comment. As we talk about crop nutrients, some of the things that your cooperative has done is we talk about balancing through all those dynamics. We're active in the marketplace. We try to position products as best we can to supply your needs and have a constant, consistent supply, so it's here when you need it and where you need it in a timely manner. So your board has authorized over the years construction of facilities to store a higher percentage of our dry fertilizer needs as well as our UAN needs. Those have been extremely important as we've seen some of the volatility in those markets, not just on pricing but also on supply to be able to do that. We've also expanded some of our marketing programs in opening up how we can help you make decisions on price protection with crop nutrients, and expanded the variety of ways of how you pay for those or the contracts that are part of that. So trying to do those things to help match up with what your needs are as you try to manage risk on your farm. Any questions? If not, how much of a break?
Yep, we're going to come back in here and start with Mr. Hobbs at 3 o'clock. So we have a half hour. The vendors will be out in the hallway there at their booths. There's snacks and drinks as well. We'll see you back in about a half hour.